Welcome, everybody. I'm Demitrius Nelon, and I'm a product manager at Microsoft, and I work primarily on WinGet, but I work on the same team that brings you the tools like PowerToys, WSL, and Windows Terminal. And I've got Ryan with me today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Fu. I've been a software engineer at Microsoft for 3 years now, and I currently work on the Windows Package Manager. This is also my first time at Build, so I'm super excited to be here, and I'm excited to show everyone all the work that we've been working on.
All right, so have you ever joined a new team, set up a new project, or tried to configure a Windows computer? I can imagine you've been through that situation. I think we all have, and we know exactly what it's like. You're probably trying to get help from somebody else to get it set up, or you're following a wiki that's got some outdated instructions. And what we really want is something that's fully automated. So Ryan, tell me a little bit about what your experiences were when you joined Microsoft.
Yeah, so when I first started working at Microsoft, I was given a lot of documentation on how to get set up. Not only were these docs extremely long, but some of them were actually outdated. I even had to ask some of my coworkers to come help me out. So overall, it took me around 3 days to get fully set up.
Wow. So I imagine once you've been through that process one time, you switched teams and joined the WinGet team. It went faster, right?
Not quite. So when I transitioned to the WinGet team, I still had a lot of the same issues as I did when I first got started. WinGet was just a completely different project with different requirements. So even though I had some experience under my belt, it still wasn't that easy.
So what would you say if I told you there was a single command that you could run and it would do everything to get your system in a ready-to-code state?
Well, Demetrius, I would say, are you kidding? That's amazing.
All right, let's show them the video. Awkward silence as we wait for everything to switch over. So what you're going to be seeing is a video that we put together, and this is different projects on GitHub, different languages, different tool chains. All of these are open source. All of them are running in a virtual machine that had nothing in it. We just run the one WinGet configure command. The YAML file that's there does all of the declarative definition of what's being configured. WinGet makes sure that it's acting as an orchestrator, pulling down all of the resources that do this work, and configuring each one of these so that as soon as they're done, you're in that ready-to-code state. And as the video finishes up, you'll see we might be launching Visual Studio and pressing F5, or we might be running a command line to actually trigger a build or a make. And I know scroll bars aren't super exciting, but if you've had to go through and set up as many projects as we have, this is a much better way to do it. I think we're ready to go back to the presentation, even though this is still going. It's just more scroll bars from that point. So these samples are already available for you today. We've checked them into the DevHome open source repository at GitHub. This link at the bottom here, aka.ms/dsc.yaml, will take you to a README file. Several of these reference a .vsconfig file that you'll need to have. So you'll need to clone the project, put this configuration file in the right location, and then run it from there. As you'll go forward, we'll hope to see more and more of these configuration files already checked into projects, but we wanted to make sure you had some samples. So when we looked at automated desired state configuration, a lot of questions came out like, how are we going to do this? Should we build a new technology, or should we leverage something that we already have? We decided to build on top of PowerShell DSC. This is a tool that's been around since about 2013. It was targeted for Windows Server and typically your production or staging environments where you were worried about drift or change. And there's a local configuration manager that was a service running in place that would pretty much clobber the system and get it back to that same state that you wanted it to be in. Things are a little bit different for developers, though. We run into cases where we do want to switch and we do want to make sure we've got the right versions of different tools, and sometimes these projects are in conflict with each other. So as we look to bring this to Windows, we're having WinGet act as a local configuration manager so that it can understand the configuration file and apply those changes for you. And one of the other reasons we picked PowerShell DSC is that it's open source, and there's already a lot of work that's been done. So you can already leverage existing Puppet, Chef, Ansible, and other orchestration configuration tools within PowerShell DSC. And you're not limited to just using WinGet as your package manager. If you want to use Chocolatey or Scoop or something else, as long as they have a DSC provider, it will just work. So your next question is, what are these DSC resources? Where do I get them from? And what are they? So they're PowerShell classes. They're domain specific, meaning they're built special purpose for whatever it is they're configuring. You might be configuring an IDE, or you might be setting some environment variables for something, or you might just be modifying some files, but they have to be written to be able to enable that capability for you. And it's very important that they're idempotent. If you haven't heard this word before, it essentially means you can run these things over and over again and they're non-destructive. If you look at a lot of scripts that you may have seen before, if you're trying to add something to your path like C program files foo, if you run that script over and over again, your path is not only going to get really long, you run the risk of having performance problems and all kinds of other strange, unwanted behaviors. So they have to be built very specifically so that they can be run over and over again. And you can find them at the PowerShell gallery. If you check the filter for DSC resources, you'll see there's a little over 300 modules out there with over 1,000 resources already built. We know we're going to need to build a lot more, and we've already started some of that work. The other place that you can go is the DSC community. This is an open source organization that's been fostering a lot of work on DSC resources over the last several years, and they've really been putting beautiful processes in place and making it easier to find and understand what's going on and how to build good resources. So the next question is, how do they work? Well, they're really simple. There's three interfaces: get, set, and test. With get, you want to get the current configuration. With test, you actually want to assert or check that it's in the state that you need it to be in. And if it's not, then you call set. That gives us the benefit of not having to run a lot of this work when we're doing the apply or when we're calling invoke DSC resource under the hood. What will happen in that case is if it's already in the right state, it's essentially a no-op, and you just get to carry on. These files, we decided to go with YAML mostly because that's what WinGet was already using, and we decided to go with a declarative format because after looking at a lot of the other orchestration tools out there, that's what they were doing as well. It seems to be a little bit easier to be able to reason about what one of these configurations is doing when you can look and see this file. If you look at something that's imperative, you're looking at a sequence of instructions. If you can imagine instructions for baking a cake, it might start out with preheat the oven, and then it might be go gather all of the ingredients, and you'll see these kinds of things happen. When you're just one person working on it, that makes perfect sense. You're going to do these steps in order. But when we go with a declarative model, we can break that out, we can distribute that work, and we can do some of these things in parallel. And we're doing a little bit of that now with what you'll be seeing in the preview that's available today. And we expect to be doing a lot more of this in the future. So let's go into an example. This is the README from Windows Terminal. This is talking about all of the prerequisites of the things that you must have installed. You'll notice some of them specify certain versions or certain minimum versions, and then you have the instructions for building the code. So this is a pretty typical thing that you'll see on a project. Often these things are outdated. Fortunately for us, Windows Terminal was up to date. I'm going to poke a little bit of fun here at Clint with PowerToys. The VS config file was out of date and didn't have all the workloads that we needed, so we gave him a hard time and we had that fixed. Now if we look at the configuration file in YAML, and we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive on this later, you can see a little bit more of the syntax here where we're specifying exactly what's happening with each one of the hyphens that you're seeing for the resources. This is really describing that unit of work. All right, been doing quite a bit of talking. I'm going to trade off, hand this over to Ryan, and let him do some live demonstrations.
All right, so in this demo, I'm going to be using WinGet as both a package manager and a configuration manager. Now, if you're not familiar with WinGet, WinGet is a command line tool that you can use to install and manage the apps on your Windows machine. So if I type in WinGet in my terminal, we're going to see all the commands available to us. Now, let's create a little scenario for ourselves. I'm looking to add a new package called NuGet to my machine. So in order to do that, I can start by searching for the package. I can do this by calling WinGet search and then NuGet. Now, WinGet knows to look in our repository for any package that matches the name NuGet. The one that we're actually interested in today has this identifier, Microsoft.NuGet. Now, let's say I'm not quite sure if this is the one. Can I see a little bit of information? I can do that by calling the show command. So if I do WinGet show --ID Microsoft.NuGet, we're going to see some of the fields from the manifest file that describe this package. So over here, we have the author, which is coming from Microsoft. We have a short little description telling us what this package is about. And we also have the installer URL, so you can download this executable. So this looks good to me. Let's actually try installing it. So if I do WinGet install --ID Microsoft.NuGet, it's going to go ahead and kick off that process and start installing NuGet for us. Now, typically, when you add a new package, you have to head to your browser, search for the app, download the installer, and then run the installer. But WinGet actually takes care of all of that, all with a single command. Now, what's special about NuGet is that NuGet is actually a portable application. This means it doesn't require an installer. Typically, when you install a portable app, you download it to a specific location, and then you add that location to your path variable. And WinGet knows how to handle this type of application. So I should be able to just type NuGet, and it'll show us all the commands available from NuGet, which is pretty cool. Another really cool thing you can do is you can actually upgrade any of your packages. So if I do WinGet upgrade, it's going to list out all of the installed apps on my machine, as well as any of the apps that have an available upgrade here. If you want to update all of these apps at the same time, you can actually use the WinGet upgrade --all flag, and that will go ahead and kick off that process to update all of these packages. So now let's say I'm done with NuGet. I don't want it on my machine anymore. I can actually run WinGet uninstall NuGet, and WinGet will know where to find that app, remove that from my system, and also clean up my path environment variable. So if I try running NuGet one more time, we're going to see that it doesn't recognize this variable anymore, and it's completely removed from my system. So moving on to the next part of the demo, I'm going to be using WinGet as a configuration manager so that I can apply my desired state configuration. So in order to get access to the configuration command, when I run NuGet right now, we're going to see that I don't have a configure command available to me. That's because it's an experimental feature. So if I run the WinGet features command, we're going to see all the features available to us that we can enable. The one that we're actually interested in today is called configuration, and we will need to modify the settings file so that we can enable this. Now, features are only available in preview releases of WinGet, so if you want to download this version of WinGet, head to this link, aka.ms/getWinGetPreview. Oh, sorry, were people taking photos of that? Okay. Good? No problem. All right. So let me make this a little smaller. So in order to enable WinGet configuration, let's head to this link. It's going to pull up a markdown file with a JSON snippet that we need to copy. So let's copy this configuration snippet, and then let's head back to our WinGet settings. So if I type in WinGet settings, it's going to pull up the JSON file responsible for modifying all of the WinGet settings. So I'm going to copy this part here and replace it with that code snippet. I'm going to remove the last comma and then save this file. So now, when I run WinGet a second time, we're going to see that we've unlocked this configure command, so we can now apply our desired state. So in this demo, I have this build demo configuration file, and I want to apply 4 state changes. The first state change is I want to enable developer mode. The second state change is I want to add a new environment variable called build 2023, and I want to set that value to hello. The third state is I want to install Node.js on my computer so that I can get access to Node Package Manager. And the last state is I want to install a Node package called Grunt. Now, one thing I wanted to point out is I also have this reset demo file, and I've been running this every time that does the exact opposite of this demo. That way I can quickly get back into the state I want so that I can do another presentation. So let's actually start by checking the state of our system. If I go to developer settings, we're going to see that I don't have developer mode enabled. If I go back to my terminal and I type in the environment variable for build 2023, we're going to see that I don't have a value assigned to that. Now, when you install Node.js, you also get access to Node Package Manager, and the alias for Node Package Manager is npm. So if I run npm, it's not going to recognize that command. And typically, you would use npm to install Grunt. So because I don't have npm, I also don't have Grunt. So let's actually go back to this configuration file. I'm going to copy the path of this so that I have it for my demo. So this is what the WinGet configure command looks like. We have 3 subcommands available to us. We have the show command, which will show us all the units of configuration that we plan to apply that's specified in the configuration file. We have the test command, and this actually tests the state of our system to verify if it matches the desired state from our configuration file. And then we also have the validate command, and this just verifies that the syntax of the configuration file is accurate. So to get started, I'm going to do winget configure, and then I'm going to pass in the path to that build demo configuration file. So it's going to go ahead and kick off that process, and as it's running, it's going to parse that configuration file and then show us each unit of configuration that we plan to apply. Now, don't worry about this part. We'll go into a little bit more detail about this later on in the presentation. So now we're hit with this big, scary warning text. And this kind of acts as a warning to the user to let them know that winget configure is an extremely powerful tool. It will modify your system. Now, it also acts as a breakpoint so that you can go back and verify that you're OK with the units of configuration that you plan to apply. So everything looks good to me. I'm going to go ahead and hit Y. I'm going to let that run. So what's really cool about this is that in the configuration file, you're specifying all the DSC resources as well as the PowerShell modules that you're calling. And WinGet knows how to look for those modules in the PowerShell gallery. So you don't have to do any prior work to install those modules on your machine. WinGet will know how to look in the PowerShell gallery, install those modules for you, and be able to run them directly from your configuration file. So let's give it a couple more seconds to finish. OK, looks like it's successfully applied. So now let's check the state of our system. So if I go back to developer settings, we're going to see that I now have developer mode enabled. Let's actually close out this window and rerun it, just so that we refresh our environment variable. And then now if I type in build 2023, we're going to see that we now have the value hello. And also with Node.js installed, we can check that by checking npm. So if I do npm, we're going to see all the commands available to us from npm. And the last thing is we want to check if that npm package was installed successfully. So if I do npm list-g and then grunt-cli, we're going to see that grunt CLI is now installed globally for us. So everything worked based on the configuration file. So let's actually head back to the presentation. We're going to go a little bit deeper into that configuration file and understand what's happening. 1 second. So in this first example, we have the configuration file for that demo we just run on the left. On the right, we have the block responsible for enabling developer mode. Now, on line 3, we have this resources dictionary, and this is where you can define all the DSC resources that you plan to call in order to apply your desired state. Now, on line 4, this is how you declare a new DSC resource along with the PowerShell module where it's coming from. So in this case, we have developer mode, which is the name of the DSC resource, as well as the name of the PowerShell module, which is Microsoft.windows.developer. In the directive section, this is the section that defines to us what's happening with the DSC resource, as well as the module. So in this case, we have a small little description called enable developer mode. And then we also have an allow pre-release Boolean value to tell us that we're installing a pre-release version of this module. And then for some of the settings, this is also can be thought of as the parameters that you're passing to the DSC resource. So in this case, we have ensure enum. And this has two values, either present or absent. By indicating present, you're indicating that you want this state to be present on your machine. So for in this case, we want developer mode to be present or enabled on our machine. In this next block, we have this block responsible for installing Node.js, as well as the npm package grunt. Now we're calling a new DSC resource called WinGet package, and it's coming from the PowerShell module, Microsoft.WinGet.DSC. Now this is a PowerShell module that our team has been working on to integrate with the WinGet client, so you can install WinGet packages. Now on line 19, we have an ID field, and this is a unique identifier to declare this single configuration unit. So in this case, we're calling it npm. And then in the directive section, we have another description telling us we're installing Node and that we're installing another pre-release module. Some of the parameters or settings that we're passing into it is the name of the package identifier for Node.js, which is openjs.node.js, and then the source, which is coming from our WinGet repository. Now in the second part, we have a new DSC resource called npm package, and this one's coming from the PowerShell module npm DSC. Now this is something our team has also been working to build out because we noticed a lot of projects do require Node.js, and we hope to make this open source so that other members of the community can continue to build on top of it. Now from lines 27 to 28, we have this depends on field, and this is where you can specify the ID of a previous configuration unit. That way, for example, in this situation, if Node.js was unable to successfully install, it wouldn't really make sense to run npm to try to install grunt. So this is how you can introduce dependencies in your configuration file. Moving on to the directives, we have a description telling us we're installing grunt. And then some of the parameters that you can pass to it is the name of the npm package, which is grunt-cli. And then we want to install this globally, so we set that value to be true. So in this next example, I have a new configuration file for setting up for the WinGet client project. Now I want you to introduce a new concept called assertions, and it's very similar to the resources dictionary that we saw on the previous slide. For assertions, we are calling DSC resources, and we're only testing the state of our resource. We're not applying any new configurations. Now the reason why this is important is because let's say you have a certain condition that you want satisfied before you begin to apply any new configurations. So for the WinGet project, we actually have a certain condition that we need the version Windows 10 19041 before you can begin applying any new configurations. So the name of this DSC resource is called OS version, and it's coming from Microsoft.windows.developer. And the parameter that you can pass to it is the minimum OS version requirement, so 19041. And in this last example, we have a new DSC resource called VS Components. It's coming from the Microsoft.visualstudio.dsc PowerShell module. And this is something that our friends over at Visual Studio have been helping us to build out, and it's already been published to the PowerShell gallery. This one helps us add new workloads and components to your Visual Studio, and you can do this by either passing in the product ID, the channel ID, as well as the VS config file that you have in your project repository. Now this special variable here, WinGet config root, that's actually replaced with the full path of the configuration file. That way you can append any relative file path after that, so you can always point to the .vsconfig file contained inside your project. So let's actually move to another demo. This time I'm going to be running a different configuration file, one that more closely resembles what it would be like to set up for your own project. So I have this new configuration file called project setup. Let's open it and take a look. So we're going to see a lot of the same DSC resources that we're calling. We have a WinGet package DSC resource that installs Visual Studio. We have a VS Components DSC resource that installs the required VS workloads that I need for my next project. In this case, I'm adding the Python workload. So if I head to Visual Studio and I try to create a new project, we're going to see that I don't have any Python templates available to me. So if I try typing in Python, we're going to see that I don't have any exact matches found. That's because I don't have the Python workload installed. So let's actually close this out, and let's copy this path, and then let's open up a new Windows terminal. Let's make this a little bigger, and then we're going to do winget configure and pass in that path. This time, I'm actually going to include the accept configuration agreements flag. And what this will do is that it will actually kick off a fully autonomous process. So before we saw that warning text that asks you to confirm, but now we fully support an automated scenario, so we'll just go ahead and start applying our desired state. Now, because we already have Visual Studio installed on our machine, WinGet knows to check the state of our computer for Visual Studio. So because we've already satisfied that condition, it's basically a no-op, and it continues on adding that workload. So adding a new workload is definitely going to take some time. Let's actually move to the dev home repository so I can show you which sample configurations we currently have available today. So in this sample configurations folder in the dev home project, we've actually built out some of the configuration files for top GitHub repositories. Let's take a look at the project over at our friends at PowerToys. So if I go to PowerToys configuration file, we're going to see a lot of the same DSC resources. So we have like developer mode, which enables developer mode. We have a WinGet package to install Visual Studio, and we have one that installs VS components from a .vsconfig file. We have other projects available to us like Redux, which is a popular JavaScript project. So if I open that configuration file, we're also going to see a lot of the same DSC resources that we've already seen in this presentation. So we have WinGet package installing Node.js. We have npm package installing Yarn. And then we have a new DSC resource called Yarn install that's coming from the PowerShell module Yarn DSC. Now, all Yarn install does is run Yarn install, and it will install all of the package dependencies required by Yarn. So our goal of creating these sample configurations is so that members of the community can actually take these configuration files and check it into their own repository. That way, anytime a new developer clones their project, they can immediately point winget configure to this .configuration file and immediately get set up. So let's actually do that for our friends over at PowerToys. So I have this PR out. I'm about to create it. I've already checked in this configuration file to a new folder called .configuration, and it's inside a new branch on my fork. So all that's missing is I need a title, so I'm going to call this build 2023 configuration file for PowerToys. And I've also linked the GitHub issue related to this feature. So I can finally close it out, Clint. I'm excited to be done with this. Let's go ahead and create that PR. So once this gets checked in, other people can now use this .configuration file, and then they can easily get set up and start building and working to develop on PowerToys. I remember when I first started working on PowerToys, I tried building it directly, and nothing worked. And then I followed the instructions, and the same thing happened. Nothing worked. So I'm hoping this configuration file will save me in the future. So let's actually go back to our demo. We can see that our configuration already finished applying. So now if I go to Visual Studio for a second time, and I try creating a new project, we're going to see that I now have Python templates available to me, so I can immediately start working on my next Python project. So that's the end of my demo. I hope you all learned a lot about WinGet and WinGet configure, so you can apply your desired state. I'm going to hand it back to Demitrius, and he's going to conclude this presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. That was awesome. I love it when a demo actually succeeds.
Yeah, me too.
All right, so some tips for building your own configuration file. We know a lot of this is very new. We actually revved the schema just in the last few days, and we're expecting some more changes to come in. But where we get started is looking at the readme.markdowns or the contributing files or those wikis or the other places that you have instructions, and start from there and start out in a clean environment. You need to be able to verify that you've got all of the right steps, all of the right tools, and all of the things that you need to have configured so that you can make sure that you can successfully build, compile, or make that project. Then you're going to need to search for the DSC resources that you can add to that configuration file, whether that's package manager resources to install things or those other domain-specific resources for configuring things. And we suggest building your file incrementally. We've learned through a lot of experience that if you kind of throw everything in there, you might get a false positive, or you might end up getting something else in the environment a little bit messed up. And then once you've got it, test it over and over again. Test it in a clean VM, test it in a sandbox, try testing it on a machine that's got some other tools. We have found some interesting interactions where you might be installing an older version. While Scott Hanselman was working on his demo, there was a new version of Node.js that was published, the version 20. We actually had to go back and drop down to version 19. And WinGet was smart enough with configuration to uninstall version 20 and correctly install version 19.9. And that was allowing us to continue with working on that project. So you're probably going to run into some of those things as you build your configurations out. So now the call to action, everybody loves those. Enable the experimental feature. You're going to need to download a preview of WinGet. There's also the possibility that your enterprise may already have group policy blocking experimental features. If that's the case, you can run winget-info. You'll be able to see any group policy settings that might be affecting you. We've also added a lot of information from community features that are added regarding paths to where portable applications get installed and where the log files are. We're recommending you build configurations for all of your Git-based projects. This is just going to make it easier so that you've got that configuration as code checked in, and everybody else coming after you is really going to appreciate it if you got it right, because all they have to do is run winget configure, and everything is going to get set up. And if they've got a common workflow where there's a lot of people iterating, you can just run git fetch and then run winget configure. And remember, they're idempotent, so it should be non-destructive. It should be non-breaking to that environment. And make sure that you've got all of the right tools and all of the right libraries that you need. The next one, this is probably not for the faint of heart. Building a DSC resource takes a bit of knowledge. You'll need to be a little bit familiar with PowerShell as well as C#. But I know the PowerShell team's got some great things they're planning to make that a little bit easier and open up some new possibilities. And last but certainly not least, give us feedback. We've actually done all of this open source. The issue was created in January. We mentioned some folks on the PowerShell team directly. We've really been doing a lot of work around trying to figure out how to make it easier to get WinGet on your systems. We also have been hearing you about getting WinGet on Windows Server, and we're thinking that DSC could be part of that path. So we've built some extra functions that will start installing the prerequisites, make it a little bit easier to get into that environment. And then from there, everything is online at GitHub. You can tweet us, you can email us, or you can just create an issue. We love the engagement from the community. We believe that your feedback is more valuable than ours because you're the ones that are building these products that everybody is using. We're just trying to help make you more productive. So with that, I'll go to Q&A. We've got a QR code that you can use to get into the chat widget. And at the end of this talk, Ryan and I will both be going to room 442 for the Windows Expert sessions. All right, so it looks like the first question we have, does WinGet configuration support or will support NVM for node versions nightmare? I think the question here is really talking about virtual environments. If you're familiar with something like Anaconda with Python, we are looking at some of those scenarios, but we have not really decided how we want to implement them. Anytime we're working with environment variables and working with them in a given session, whether that's PowerShell or CMD, we run into lots of challenges, but we'd love your feedback there. Next question from Aaron L. This is a great question. I assume this needs to be run as admin. I can definitely tell you that most of the resources that are going to be useful for you do require admin, like the Visual Studio resource for adding workloads and components. It also needs to make sure that Visual Studio is not running when you're using that one. And we're going to continue partnering with those other teams and making sure that the experiences are better. We did actually build 2 pipelines for this. So there is a non-administrative process and an administrative process. so that once we further enlighten the configuration itself, we'll be able to run things in user mode that require that or that don't require elevation. And as an added benefit in DevHome, if you use DevHome to run your configuration, you get a single UAC experience. We have run into some edge cases where some installers will still trigger another UAC, but that's what we've been working towards, is a better streamless experience. All right, can the repository be changed to local machine repository or LAN? I'm assuming this question is related to the PowerShell sources, so like PowerShell Gallery. So you might be using another product or an Azure DevOps-based feed for the NuGet packages. And we've actually done some testing with that ourselves, standing up private feeds. We've had a lot of great success with that. We did run into some bumps with authentication, and we're looking at improving those experiences. But you can host your own private resources, just like you can host a private WinGet repository. Next question. How does automatic dev setup using WinGet and DSC relate to the dev container feature in VS Code? So these are completely different types of products. Visual Studio Code's container story is a little bit different. We are going to be working with them to figure out where we can have a good tie-in and where it makes sense to leverage the same types of tools. But for right now, the WinGet configuration is going to work in the local environment that you're running in. And if you wanted to run this inside of a container or inside of a virtual machine, you'd want to go ahead and run WinGet configuration inside of that environment. We are looking at targeting other environments in the future, and we'd love to hear from you which ones you think are the most important for us to target. Next question, are you using the built-in DSC v1.1, or are you using the newer v2 or v3? Technically, we're using v2. We're not using the MOF file at all. We have abstracted the need for that, and we've actually worked with the PowerShell team so that we can call invoke DSC resource directly and use that inside of WinGet configuration. Next question is about prerequisites for installing WinGet. If you install it through the Microsoft Store, there's not going to be any prerequisites. If you're doing this from the GitHub repository, you may need to go ahead and install vclibs as well as WinUI XAML, but all of that is documented on our GitHub repository. Where to request or submit commonly useful DSC resources. This is another area that we would love to get some feedback. Right now, the mapping where you're going from a WinGet package ID or a Chocolatey package ID and trying to map that to a PowerShell DSC resource is a little bit challenging. They don't always have the same names, and there might be some limited functionality there. I think we're going to be putting up some manual mappings based on the sample configurations that we've got, and we're looking at the possibility of building a service or something that makes it easier to map the two of these things together so that it's a little bit more discoverable, and we're looking for some feedback on that front as well. When will this be released as stable? That's a great question, and you always get the non-committal response there. We're targeting September. We'd like to have this done in the next 6 months, but as we run into edge cases, if there's anything else that happens, we need to make sure that we build this correctly so that we can get it out there and make sure that we're confident in what it's doing and that we have the ability to support it. So this is definitely considered an experimental feature until it ships in a stable version. In fact, when we release stable versions, experimental features aren't even there and they're not even available for those enterprise users. Next question. How does WinGet handle the situation where a tool has been installed previously outside of WinGet? This is one of the unique benefits of WinGet compared to a lot of other package managers. We're looking at the data that's in the registry that's feeding Windows apps and features. So we'll see things like package family names for MSIX packages. We'll see product code or upgrade code if it's in MSI. And we'll see similar metadata if the installer is an executable that actually writes those registry entries. So WinGet will look at those. It will attempt to correlate between that it read in the registry and any package in any configured source, even your private ones, to try to see if we can find a match so that WinGet can upgrade those packages if there's new versions available. Is this a replacement for group policy is the next question. No, not at all. We've actually had to add group policy for WinGet, and because of the interfaces that we're doing with the COM APIs for integration, we're adding even more group policy so that enterprises can control how this works because it is such a powerful tool. The next question is, will this work only under Windows 11? No. We've got this working all the way down to Windows 10 RS5. Even though that operating system is out of support, there hasn't been any compelling reason for us to migrate and go forward and cut off any compatibility concerns. So we're going to try to stay down level as low as we can, as long as we can, until we find a reason that forces us to make a breaking change. All right, Ryan, so one question for you. When you were building the DSC resources that you were working on for the third-party package managers, what kinds of things did you experience?
Yeah, so when I first started working on the DSC resources, I actually was able to talk to Gail Colas from the DSC community, and he gave me a rundown on how DSC resources actually work. There's also documentation on Microsoft Learn on how to build out DSC resources, but I would definitely say it's quite a steep learning curve. There's a lot of things I wasn't familiar with, and I'm also quite new to PowerShell as well. So it was pretty tough.
So in your demo, when you were installing Grunt CLI, was WinGet doing that install, or was something else doing that install?
No, that was npm doing that install. So WinGet actually only installs Node.js, and then WinGet configure is calling npm to install Yarn.
So
Grunt CLI.
So I know there's a Chocolatey DSC resource. Does that mean I can use Chocolatey to install packages and not use WinGet, even though I'm using WinGet configuration?
Yes, definitely. You can use WinGet configure to call on Chocolatey, and their DSC resource.
What about Scoop?
Scoop as well.
All right. So we've covered a lot of content. This was definitely a deep dive session on what we're doing, and this is highly evolving. So I would definitely recommend stay in touch. You can follow me on Twitter. You can keep track on GitHub. Everything that we're doing is done in the public, and we'll be handing this schema and the configuration format over to the PowerShell team as they get closer to their release of PowerShell DSC v3. We've been working with a lot of other teams and a lot of other partners. If you've been seeing the announcements from the Microsoft DevBox, we've been working with them on how they'll be able to leverage the same task model where they can install WinGet packages, as well as apply a WinGet configuration into your Microsoft DevBox environment. So this has really been a broad initiative looking at a lot of teams across Microsoft, and we've been doing a lot of work here trying to understand what are the experiences that you're having and what can we do to make developing on Windows the best experience possible. So like I said, we're going to be going over to room 442 after this for Ask the Experts with the Windows team, and I don't see any other questions in the chat.